The second to the last chapter takes on the issue of leading, managing, and following. And an assertion of the authors is that because we're not, in an SMO, we're not providing the kind of bureaucratic structure to which people might be accustomed, the sort of thing that they might have seen in a CCO, that leadership plays an increasingly important role, because without those structures to guide people's behavior, and remember, structure includes things like standard operating procedures, job description, all this kind of stuff. Without that, leadership really needs to step up to help people understand what needs to be done, why it needs to be done, different approaches to getting things done, etc. So talking about leaders and managers, organizing, controlling, that's what the authors will say is that's managing versus leading. Okay, this is actually one of my pet peeves. So I'm going to share it with you. I believe that it's possible for someone to be a leader without being a manager. And that's because there's this phenomenon of emergent leadership or informal leadership. So one need not have a title and authority in order to influence other people. And at the end of the day, leadership is really about influencing other people. So yes, I think it's absolutely possible for someone to be a leader and not be a manager. I don't have any problem with that. But when it comes to, is it possible to be a manager without being a leader? Sort of. So do I think we have people in management positions who are not effective leaders? Yes, absolutely, for all kinds of reasons. Do I think that's the way it ought to be, that somehow we want to separate those who manage and those who lead, in the sense that we've got all these managers who are in the hierarchy, but we're not expecting them to lead? I think that's bogus. I really think that in order for you to be an effective manager, you've got to be able to have a vision, to plan, even if it's at a lower level of the organization, no problem. You've got to be able to organize, to enable that planning, to create the structures, etc., that enable the plans, enable people to accomplish the goals. You've got to be engaged in controlling, which is making sure that what you planned and what actually happens, that somehow these two things align. And you have to be able to lead. You have to be able to encourage people to do what's necessary to accomplish the goals that are set by the plan. I think it's really tough to imagine someone that we would call, yeah, they're a great manager, if they weren't also a leader. Now, I think some people get hung up on thinking about leaders as, oh, these are the people who are able to speak, like a Martin Luther King, something like that. So they confuse charisma and leadership, and they're not the same thing. You needn't be a charismatic speaker, in order to be a really effective leader. Okay, so let's dive a little bit more into what Lawler and Worley are saying. So they say, again, SMOs need to have good leadership because they don't have the structures that, let's say, CCOs have, and I think that's a reasonable point. Another way of looking at this, by the way, is that you can use standard operating procedures and other kinds of policies and so on as substitutes for leadership. So if things are very well articulated and delineated, then you probably don't need as many people serving in a leadership role. At least there's a stream in the research that talks about substitutes for leadership, which can again include structure. So Lawler and Worley end this particular piece of the discussion by saying you need to find the right balance of management and leadership. And it just doesn't fit with my personal experience in organizations, my own research. This is just one of those things that I think people enjoy saying, and on the face of it, it seems to have some face validity. That, oh yeah, I've known people who had a management position and they weren't good leaders at all. Well, they weren't good managers then, okay? Again, it's reasonable to expect that people will be able to lead others, even if they have a lower level position. That shouldn't make any difference. In terms of sharing power, and this is where I think Lawler and Worley start to stumble a little bit in their own construction. So keep in mind the conversation about traveling light. And, we want to buy skills, and we don't want people to get too attached. And we need to be able to be flexible and, if necessary, let people go. Okay, now, keeping all of that in mind, just track with me as I discuss some of the next points in chapter 11, where it says we need to share power in ways that build commitment and motivation. Okay, if we're traveling light, that doesn't seem to jive very well with the whole notion of building commitment. And now we're going to talk some more about power sharing. So they say we need to balance the need for power sharing. Again, I'm a pretty practical person, so I'm thinking two things right away. I'm thinking, first of all, show me the evidence that actually backs up this particular assertion. What does that even, and then what does that even mean? Okay, so show me some evidence. And secondly, can you give me some more details specifically as to what that looks like? And here's where I think, again, Lawler and Worley needed to do a little bit more reflection in thinking about their overall model. So they say things like this on page 258. Overall, SMOs need leaders at all levels who are willing and able to translate the organization strategy into practices that support and reward individuals who do the right things and that correct individuals who do the wrong things. Now, first of all, I would say that's true in any kind of organization, whether it's a sustainably managed organization or some other kind of organization. So that isn't a particularly, it's not a unique component of what I might think of when I think of a sustainably managed organization. Second of all, in this part, Lawler and Worley are saying, we need leaders at all levels who are willing and able to translate the organization's strategy. Okay, keep in mind that earlier in the text, when they're talking about who should be involved in developing the strategy, they're giving a lot of the work for that only to the people at the top. People on the board, people at the top. But then somehow all of this gets communicated really effectively to the people down below so that they too can advocate on behalf of that strategy. And I'm going to take you back to a point that I would have made earlier in the semester, which is this. If you really want people throughout the organization to commit to something and you want them to get on board and to advocate, then you really need to engage them in not every single detail of the strategy creation. Don't get me wrong, that isn't necessary. It's not a very efficient use of people's time. But if you want people to own something, they have to have had a chance to weigh in. And so this is, to me, one of the contradictions in the Lawler and Worley work. Okay, we want all these people to be advocates. Okay, then we're going to have to do a little bit more to make sure they're engaged in the actual strategy creation. The authors also talk about the need to lead and accommodate continuous change. And I think there's some good narrative in this part of the chapter. And frankly, I would say, consistent with what some of you have observed, this isn't new narrative necessarily. In fact, most of it goes back to the quality movement. So starting, around 1980, when people like Deming et al. Are really starting to finally get through to their American counterparts. People in Japan were listening to the quality gurus long before people in the United States were. And this whole notion of leading and accommodating continuous change, continuous quality improvement, again, a lot of the ideas, they are good ones, and they do have relevance, and they do have support in actual practice, because we've been able to observe them for 30 plus years in the United States and another 20 to 30 years prior to that in other parts of the world. So leaders need to be able to translate what our organizational goals and mission are into meaningful work and information flows. So here's sort of the big picture. This is where we're going. Now, here's how we get from that big picture to here's where you are, and here's what you're doing, and not a job description, right? But here's the set of activities in which you find yourself participating, and here's how all of those activities add up to our synergistic whole. This helping people to understand the role that they play and how critical their role is in fact really important. It adds to people's task identity so they can see how what they do contributes to the whole, and it adds to their understanding of the task's significance so they can see that in fact what they do really matters, and if they're not able to fulfill their function, how the overall system suffers as a result. It says people also have to be able to view the external environment effectively and accurately. And this is an area where we would talk about this in org theory. We would say people have to be good boundary spanners. They have to be paying attention to what's happening outside the organization and really using that information to influence what happens inside. Next, the authors talk about creating and encouraging a culture in which leadership is shared. Okay, so how do we make this happen? Now, I want to very quickly note that we could be talking almost everything I've talked about so far. You could say would be true in any organization, and it isn't specific to a sustainably managed organization. And this is another great example. So whether we were talking about an HIO or an SMO, I think this notion that we want to encourage a culture in which leadership is shared, that's going to be the same, right? So, and everybody plays a different role. So you're at this level of management versus this level versus this level. Your role changes, but keeping in mind that those lower level managers, those folks near those frontline employees, their role in creating and maintaining the culture is at least as important as the role played by top managers. And, you know, especially in Western culture at this point, we've really gotten hooked on sort of celebrity CEOs and celebrity C-suite members. And at the end of the day, for most people, the most influential leader is the one they report to, wherever they happen to be in the organization. So again, we need to make sure that these folks, no matter where they are in the organization, really are grasping what it is that we want our culture to focus on. Now here I would jump in with, so what that means is sustainability as one of our norms. And so we're always trying to think of not only how do we make sure that we're seeing ROI in terms of the bottom line that's economic, but how are we making sure that we're seeing ROI in terms of the bottom line that's people? How are we making sure that we're seeing ROI in the bottom line that is the planet? Okay, are we making decisions that are consistent with balancing those three critical bottom lines? That's what the culture needs to be focused on, right? So very quickly, some key points. You know, we can't have that sort of rock star CEO, that person that everyone bows down to. We're waiting for that person to tell the troops, you know, to give us our marching orders. In fact, again, this leadership needs to be distributed. This understanding of what sustainability is and how we operationalize that in our organization, that has to be distributed throughout the organization. Everybody needs to not only be, it's one thing to be a leader, but we also have to know when and how to be a really effective follower, which involves two things. One, being very active. So being willing to act, being willing to do, that's prerequisite number one if you want to be a really effective follower. And number two, you have to be an independent thinker. You have to be willing to say to people, the emperor has no clothes. What we're talking about doing is not consistent with our vision and mission. People have to feel confident that they can say what needs to be said. That's, in fact, the best kind of follower. The person who simply rolls over and says yes to whatever a leader says without thinking critically, that person is ultimately not helpful to the leader and to the enterprise. So effective followership, in fact, has an awful lot in common with effective leadership. The qualities are almost exactly the same. And that's really, when you say shared leadership, it's really people sort of morphing in and out of their, you know, I'm a leader, I'm a follower, I'm both, I'm occupying both roles. Again, Lawler and Worley talk about a number of ideas there on the bottom of the first page of your lecture outline, talking about what leaders who are managers should do. And one of them is, you know, having expertise in performance management. And it ends with being a good follower. And my advice to you is read all of those, get to know them, and then get ready for the second part of this chapter. Thanks.